Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we travel to a time when thoughts themselves could be crimes, when the very beliefs that shaped your understanding of the world might mark you for judgment. Settle yourself comfortably, let your breathing slow, and imagine stepping into an age where heresy was not merely disagreement, but an invisible transgression that could cost everything. In the medieval world, faith was not personal, it was communal, institutional, and above all, carefully monitored. The line between orthodoxy and heresy was often as thin as a whisper, as fragile as a moment's doubt. You might think yourself safe in your own mind, but even there, unseen eyes were watching. Unseen ears were listening. Tonight, we explore a justice system that needed no evidence of wrongdoing, no witnesses to crimes, no proof beyond suspicion and fear. We'll walk through interrogation chambers where silence was confession and words were traps. We'll witness the courage of those who chose truth over safety and examine the archaeological remnants of a system that left its mark in blood and ashdod. This is the story of medieval heresy trials, where your thoughts could condemn you, can justice wore the mask of divine authority. Close your eyes, breathe deeply. Let us begin this gentle descent into a world where the most dangerous place to be was inside your own mind. The stone walls around you seem to absorb sound, creating a peculiar quietness that makes even your heartbeat feel too loud. You sit on a wooden stool, its surface worn smooth by countless others who have occupied this same position before you. The room is neither large nor small, perhaps the size of a modest chapel, but the vaulted ceiling stretches high above, disappearing into shadows that seem to press downward with their weight. Brother Thomas, your interrogator, sits across from you at a heavy oak table. His brown Franciscan habit is simple, even humble, but his eyes hold a sharpness that suggests years of practice in reading the subtle signs of guilt and innocence. His hands, pale and sought from a life of scholarship rather than manual labor, rest gently on the leather-bound volume before him. This is the manual of procedure, the carefully codified rules that will govern every moment of your examination. We begin with prayer, he says, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to ritual. You bow your head as his words invoke divine guidance, asking that truth might emerge from this encounter. But even as you listen, you cannot help but notice how his fingers trace the edge of the book, how his breathing remains perfectly controlled. This is not his first interrogation, nor will it be his last. The questions begin simply enough. Your name, your birthplace, your occupation. These feel safe, factual, impossible to answer incorrectly. But as Brother Thomas records each response with careful precision, you begin to understand that nothing here is truly simple. Each detail becomes part of a larger pattern, each answer a thread in a tapestry whose final design remains hidden from you. Tell me about your prayers, he continues, and suddenly the ground beneath you feels less stable. Do you pray the Ave Maria correctly? Have you ever stumbled over the words of the Pater Noster? The questions seem innocent, but you sense the careful attention behind them. The way his pen pauses above the parchment as he waits for your response, you realize that every moment of your spiritual life is now subject to scrutiny. The time you fell asleep during Mass last Sunday, was that mere exhaustion from a long week of labor, or evidence of spiritual indifference? The day you questioned, even briefly, whether all the Church's teachings about purgatory made complete sense, that momentary doubt now feels like a weight pressing against your chest. Brother Thomas asks about your neighbors, your conversations, your thoughts on recent sermons. Has anyone in your village expressed unusual ideas about the sacraments? Have you heard whispers of criticism about the local priest? Questions weave through your memory like threads through cloth, and you begin to see how easily an innocent comment might be transformed to evidence of heretical thinking. The afternoon light filtering through the single window gradually dims, torches unlit to illuminate the proceedings. In the flickering light, Brother Thomas's face takes on an almost ethereal quality, as if he were more spirit than flesh. His questions continue with the same gentle persistence. Never harsh, never threatening, but always probing deeper into the landscape of your mind. Faith, he explains during a brief pause, not merely what we profess with our lips, but what we truly believe in our hearts. The Church, in its wisdom, has learned to distinguish between the two. His words carry the weight of centuries of theological development, of countless councils and papal decrees that have refined the art of detecting spiritual corruption. You find yourself examining your own beliefs with new intensity. Do you truly accept the doctrine of transubstantiation, or have you sometimes wondered how bread and wine could become flesh and blood? When you recite the creed, do you mean every word, or do some phrases feel like foreign sounds in your mouth? These questions, which might once have seemed abstract, now feel urgent, potentially dangerous. The interrogation continues through the evening hours, each question building upon the last. Brother Thomas's approach is methodical, almost scientific in its precision. He asks about your reading habits, though, as a peasant, you cannot read. He inquires about your knowledge of Scripture, testing whether you might have heard unauthorized interpretations from traveling preachers or learned neighbors. Heresy, he explains, is often subtle. It rarely announces itself with bold declarations. Instead, it whispers in moments of doubt. It flourishes in the spaces between official teachings and personal understanding. Our task is to illuminate these shadows, to bring clarity where confusion might otherwise take root. As the hours pass, you begin to understand the true nature of your situation. This is not merely an investigation of specific actions or statements. This is an examination of your very soul, a careful mapping of the territory of your belief. Every hesitation in your answers, every moment of uncertainty, becomes a landmark in this spiritual geography. The process feels endless, circular, as if each answer only generates new questions. Brother Thomas maintains his gentle demeanor throughout, never raising his voice, never showing impatience. But beneath his scholarly calm, you sense the weight of institutional authority. It's the power to reshape not just your future, but your understanding of your own past. When he finally sets down his pen and closes the manual, the silence that follows feels profound. You have been dissected, examined, cataloged. Whether you have passed or failed this examination remains unclear, but you know with certainty that you are no longer the same person who entered this room hours ago. The morning brings new anxieties as you return to the interrogation chamber. Brother Thomas greets you with the same courteous demeanor, but today there is something different in his approach. He has spent the night reviewing your responses, comparing them to the careful notes he has made, and now he begins to probe the spaces between your words. Yesterday, he begins, you spoke of your devotion to the Virgin Mary. Tell me, what did you mean when you said she watches over your daily work? The question seems innocent enough, but you notice how he emphasizes certain words, how his eyes never leave your face as you consider your response. You had meant nothing more than the simple faith that sustains countless believers, the comfort of knowing that holy figures care for ordinary people. But now, under his scrutiny, you wonder if your words might have suggested something more troubling. Did you imply that Mary acts independently of God's will? Did you suggest that prayer to her might be more effective than prayer to Christ himself? The silence stretches between you as you struggle to find words that cannot be misinterpreted. But Brother Thomas seems to find meaning in your hesitation itself. His pen moves across the parchment, recording not just your eventual answer, but the length of time it took you to provide it, the expressions that crossed your face during those moments of uncertainty. Silence, he explains gently, can be as revealing as speech. When a faithful Christian is asked about core doctrines, the response should be immediate, confident, drawn from the well of genuine belief. Citation suggests doubt, and doubt is the first step toward heresy. This logic feels like a trap closing around you. To answer quickly might suggest that you have prepared responses, that you are trying to conceal something. To answer slowly implies doubt or confusion. To remain silent becomes an admission of guilt. You begin to understand that the system itself is designed to find fault, to uncover the seeds of heretical thinking that supposedly lurk in every human heart. Brother Thomas returns to questions about your community, but now his inquiries take on a different character. He asks about old Agnes, who sometimes mutters during Mass about young Willem. Once asked why the scriptures were not read in the common tongue. These had seemed like innocent quirks of personality, but now you see how they might be interpreted as signs of spiritual corruption. The Church, he continues, has learned over centuries that heresy spreads like a contagion. It passes from person to person through casual conversation, through seemingly innocent questions, through the gradual erosion of proper reverence. Our task is to identify these patterns before they can take root and flourish. You find yourself remembering conversations differently now, viewing them through the lens of potential heretical contamination. The day Willem wondered aloud why priests should be celibate. The evening when Agnes questioned whether paying for prayers might not be simpler than performing them yourself. These moments just seemed like natural human curiosity. Now, feel fraught with danger. The afternoon brings a new development. Brother Thomas produces a piece of parchment covered with dense Latin text. KISS, he explains, is a list of propositions that have been identified as heretical. I will read each one, and you will tell me whether you have ever heard any of these ideas expressed in your community. The list is extensive, covering subtle theological distinctions that you barely understand. Some propositions seem obviously wrong, but others touch on questions that have occurred to you in moments of private reflection. The idea that good works might be more important than faith, the suggestion that the church's wealth might be contrary to Christian teaching, the notion that personal prayer might be as effective as formal sacraments. These thoughts have flickered through your mind. And now you discover that they are considered dangerous heresies. Have you, Brother Thomas asks, ever wondered whether the Pope's authority extends to matters of temporal governance? Have you ever questioned whether the Church's vast landholdings are consistent with the poverty that Christ embraced? Questions seem to reach directly into your private thoughts, as if he possesses some supernatural ability to read your mind. The weight of accumulated hours begins to press upon you. Your responses become more careful, more calculated, as you try to navigate between honesty and self-preservation. But this very calculation seems to be what Brother Thomas is looking for. He notes your increasing caution, your growing reluctance to speak freely, as if these two are symptoms of spiritual corruption. Truth, he says, should flow as naturally as water from a spring. When we must strain to produce it, when we must carefully consider each word, we reveal the barriers that sin has erected between our souls and God's light. His words carried the authority of centuries of theological development, of countless predecessors who have refined these techniques of spiritual examination. As the day draws to a close, realize that you have been fundamentally changed by this process. The simple faith that once sustained you has been complicated by questions you had never thought to ask. The community that once felt like family now seems potentially dangerous, filled with hidden threats and secret corruptions. The very act of thinking has become suspect, as if the mind itself were a source of spiritual pollution. Brother Thomas closes his manual with the same careful ceremony that has marked every aspect of these proceedings. But you sense that this is not an ending, merely a pause in a process that has taken on its own momentum. Tomorrow will bring new questions, new opportunities for your words to be weighed and measured and found wanting. In the heart of Bohemia, where the Vltava River winds through Prague's ancient stones, a different kind of interrogation was taking shape in the early years of the 15th century. The city itself seemed to pulse with intellectual energy, its university halls echoing with debates that would have been unthinkable in smaller, more isolated communities. Here, in rooms lined with precious manuscripts and warmed by braziers that cast dancing shadows on vaulted ceilings, the greatest minds of Central Europe gathered to wrestle with questions that touched the very foundations of Christian belief. Jan Hus stood before his students in the lecture hall of the University of Prague's voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had spent decades studying the deepest mysteries of faith. At 45, he possessed the kind of intellectual confidence that came from years of rigorous scholarship, yet his eyes held a gentleness that spoke of genuine pastoral concern. His students, young men from across the Holy Roman Empire, hung on his every word as he explored the complex relationship between personal faith and institutional authority. "Consider," he said, his fingers tracing the edge of a leather-bound volume of Augustine's writings, "what our Lord meant when he said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. Did he speak of an institutional way or a personal path? Did he describe a collective truth or an individual revelation?" These questions, which might have seemed purely academic to outside observers, carried profound implications for the structure of medieval Christianity. The afternoon sun, streaming through the tall windows, illuminated dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, and in this peaceful setting, it was easy to forget that such questions were becoming increasingly dangerous. Hus himself seemed aware of the delicate ground he was treading, pausing frequently to emphasize his devotion to the Church, his respect for legitimate authority, his desire only to understand and teach the truth as God had revealed it. But even as he spoke these words of reassurance, his students could sense the deeper currents of his thinking. His lectures increasingly drew upon the writings of John Wycliffe, the English theologian whose ideas about church reform had been condemned by multiple councils. Hus did not embrace Wycliffe's most radical propositions, but he found in the English scholar's work a framework for understanding the relationship between divine authority and human institution that resonated with his own experience. The transformation of Jan Hus from respected academic to dangerous heretic did not happen overnight. It began with small observations, subtle criticisms of practices that seemed to contradict the gospel message. He noticed how the sale of indulgences had become a lucrative business, how ecclesiastical positions were bought and sold like commodities, how the vast wealth of the church hierarchy contrasted sharply with the poverty of Christ and his apostles. These observations led to questions, and questions led to public statements that gradually attracted attention beyond the university walls. Hus began to preach in the Bethlehem chapel, where his sermons in the Czech language drew crowds of ordinary believers who had never before heard theological concepts explained in words they could understand. His message was not revolutionary in its content, but it was radical in its accessibility. The church, he told his congregation one autumn evening, the chapel filled with the warm glow of candles and the quiet rustle of wool garments, is not a building of stone and mortar. It is not a hierarchy of offices and titles. The true church is the community of all believers, united by faith in Christ's sacrifice and committed to following his teachings. These words, which seemed to offer comfort and inclusion to his listeners, would later be interpreted as a fundamental challenge to ecclesiastical authority. The political dimensions of Hus's situation became increasingly complex as his influence grew. Bohemia was experiencing a period of intense nationalism, with Czech speakers feeling increasingly marginalized by the German-speaking clergy who dominated the church hierarchy. Hus's use of the vernacular in his sermons, and his emphasis on the rights of local communities to understand and interpret scripture appealed to these nationalist sentiments in ways that made his theological positions seem even more threatening to established authority. King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia found himself in a delicate position, caught between his desire to maintain good relations with the church and his recognition that Hus had become a symbol of Czech identity and intellectual independence. The king's court was filled with nobles who saw in Hus's movement an opportunity to challenge the extensive landholdings and political influence of the church, while also containing clergy who viewed the reformer as a dangerous threat to the established order. As news of Hus's teachings spread beyond Bohemia, they began to attract attention from the highest levels of church authority. His writings were examined by theologians in Paris, Rome, and other centers of learning, and gradually, a consensus emerged that his ideas, however carefully expressed, contained the seeds of heretical thinking. The process of official condemnation began to take shape, but it would unfold with the characteristic slowness of medieval bureaucracy. The letters that arrived at the university carried the weight of centuries of institutional authority. Its cardinals and bishops, writing from palaces decorated with gold and precious stones, expressed their concern about the spiritual welfare of Bohemian Christians. Their language was formal and diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. Jan Hus must either modify his teachings or face the consequences of a persistent heresy. Hus responded to these challenges with the same scholarly precision that had marked his academic career. He wrote lengthy treatises defending his positions, citing scripture and the church fathers, demonstrating his deep knowledge of theological tradition. But his very erudition seemed to make him more dangerous in the eyes of his critics. An ignorant heretic might be dismissed as a simple fool, but a learned heretic possessed the tools to spread sophisticated arguments that could corrupt many souls. The pressure on Hus intensified as political alliances shifted across Europe. The Great Western Schism had created a situation where multiple claimants to the papal throne competed for legitimacy, and each sought to demonstrate his orthodoxy by taking strong positions against suspected heretics. Hus found himself caught in the crossfire of these larger conflicts, his fate increasingly determined by factors far beyond his control. The daily rhythm of his life began to change as the circle of official disapproval tightened around him. Students who had once eagerly attended his lectures now stayed away, fearing association with a suspected heretic. Colleagues who had shared his concerns about church reform distanced themselves as the stakes grew higher. The intellectual community that had once provided him with support and encouragement gradually fragmented under the pressure of institutional opposition. Yet, Hus continued his work with a determination that seemed to draw strength from the very opposition he faced. Sermons became more direct, his writings more urgent, as if he sensed that time was running out. He spoke increasingly of the need for individual Christians to take responsibility for their own spiritual development, to study scripture for themselves rather than relying entirely on clerical interpretation. It's truth, he told his remaining students, during what would prove to be one of his final lectures, cannot be destroyed by human authority. It may be suppressed, its advocates silenced, but it possesses a power that transcends earthly institutions. Our task is not to create truth, but to recognize it, to serve it, and to trust that it will ultimately prevail. These words, spoken in the fading light of a Prague afternoon, would soon be tested by the most severe trial that medieval Christianity could devise. The machinery of institutional justice was already in motion, and Jan Hus would soon discover whether his faith in truth's ultimate triumph could sustain him through the ordeal that lay ahead. The city of Constance, in the winter of 1414, presented a spectacle of ecclesiastical power that had rarely been equaled in the history of Christendom. Delegates from across Europe had gathered for a council that promised to heal the Great Western Schism and restore unity to a church that had been torn apart by competing papal claims. The narrow streets teemed with cardinals and bishops, their scarlet and purple robes creating splashes of color against the gray stone buildings, while lesser clergy hurried between meetings, carrying sealed documents that would determine the fate of Christianity for generations to come. Jan Hus arrived in this charged atmosphere, carrying a document that he believed would protect him from harm. The safe conduct issued by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund guaranteed his safety while traveling to and from the council, and promised that he would be free to present his case without fear of arrest or imprisonment. The parchment, with its elaborate seals and ceremonial language, represented the protection of the highest secular authority in Europe, and Hus trusted that it would allow him to defend his teachings before the assembled representatives of the Church. The accommodations provided for the Bohemian delegation were modest but comfortable, located in a house near the cathedral where the council sessions would take place. Hus spent his first evenings in Constance preparing his arguments, reviewing the scriptures and patristic texts that supported his positions, and praying for the wisdom to present his case clearly and convincingly. The quiet of his chamber, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps in the street below, provided a stark contrast to the momentous events that were about to unfold. The initial meetings between Hus and the council's representatives seemed to proceed according to the normal patterns of scholarly debate. Cardinals and theologians questioned him about specific passages from his writings, asking for clarification of phrases that seemed to challenge established doctrine. Hus responded with the same careful precision that had marked his academic career, citing authorities and making distinctions that demonstrated his deep knowledge of theological tradition. But as the days passed, Hus began to sense that something fundamental was changing in the nature of these discussions. The questions became more accusatory, less interested in genuine clarification than in forcing him to defend positions that had been taken out of context. His responses were interrupted, his citations dismissed, his attempts to explain the nuances of his thought cut short by impatient officials. Q seemed to have already reached their conclusions. The moment when the safe conduct was effectively revoked came not through any formal announcement, but through a gradual shift in the conditions of his residence. Guards appeared at his door, ostensibly for his protection, but their presence made it clear that his freedom of movement was now restricted. The comfortable chamber that had been his sanctuary became a cell, and the scholarly discussions that had begun with such promise transformed into formal interrogations. The emperor's protection, explained Cardinal Daly during one of these sessions, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, extends only to those who present themselves as faithful sons of the Church. When heretical opinions are expressed, when dangerous doctrines are defended, the normal protections of civil authority must give way to the higher authority of spiritual jurisdiction. This logic, which reduced the emperor's solemn guarantee to a conditional promise that could be withdrawn at the first sign of theological disagreement, revealed the true nature of the power relationships that governed medieval Europe. Secular authority, however impressive its ceremonies and elaborate its claims, ultimately derived its legitimacy from the Church's approval, and that approval could be withdrawn whenever spiritual interests demanded it. The formal charges against Hus were presented in a document that reflected months of careful preparation by the council's theological experts. Each of his major writings had been scrutinized, dissected, and analyzed for evidence of heretical thinking. Statements that he had made in different contexts were assembled into a comprehensive indictment that painted a picture of systematic deviation from orthodox teaching. The accusation that struck Hus most forcefully was the claim that he had taught the doctrine of predestination in a way that undermined the authority of the Church's sacramental system. According to his accusers, he had suggested that individual salvation depended entirely on God's eternal decree, making the intercession of priests and the performance of religious rituals essentially meaningless. This interpretation of his teachings, while not entirely inaccurate, ignored the careful qualifications and distinctions that had marked his actual writings. "I have never taught," Hus protested during one particularly intense session, that the sacraments are without value, or that the church's ministry is unnecessary. I have only suggested that these external forms must be accompanied by genuine faith, that ritual without belief is empty ceremony. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, as if his accusers were determined to hear only what confirmed their predetermined conclusions. The process of theological examination that followed revealed the sophisticated machinery that the church had developed for identifying and condemning heretical teaching. Teams of scholars worked through Huss's writings with the methodical precision of lawyers preparing a case, identifying specific phrases that could be interpreted as supporting condemned propositions, documenting patterns of thought that seemed to align with known heresies. The comparison with John Wycliffe's teachings became a central element in the case against Huss. The English reformers' ideas had been formally condemned by previous councils, and any similarity between his doctrines and those of the Bohemian scholar was treated as evidence of heretical influence. Huss's protests that he had never accepted Wycliffe's most radical propositions were dismissed as irrelevant. The mere presence of similar ideas in his work was sufficient to establish guilt by association. The daily routine of his confinement took on a grinding monotony that seemed designed to wear down his resistance. He was awakened before dawn for lengthy interrogation sessions that might continue until well past sunset. Questions were repetitive, skewing back to the same themes and accusations with a persistence that suggested his examiners believed that exhaustion might accomplish what argument had failed to achieve. The psychological pressure of his situation was intensified by the gradual isolation from his supporters. Letters from Bohemia were intercepted and examined before being delivered, and many never reached him at all. The few visitors who were permitted to see him were carefully monitored. Their conversations limited to matters that had been approved in advance by the council's officials. As winter deepened and the council sessions continued, Huss began to understand that his fate had been decided long before he arrived in Constance. The elaborate procedures of examination and debate were not genuine attempts to discover truth, but rather ceremonial preparations for a conclusion that had been predetermined by political and institutional necessity. The council needed to demonstrate its authority by condemning a prominent heretic, and he had been selected to fulfill that role. The offers of mercy that came during this period were presented as generous concessions, opportunities for him to save himself through timely repentance, if he would simply acknowledge his errors, renounce the dangerous ideas that had been identified in his writings, and submit to the authority of the council. He could return to Bohemia as a reformed and rehabilitated teacher. The alternative, though never explicitly stated, was becoming increasingly clear. Truth, Huss wrote in one of his letters from prison. The words formed carefully by candlelight in his cold cell cannot be renounced without destroying the soul that has embraced it. To deny what God has revealed through scripture and reason is to commit a sin far greater than any physical suffering that might result from remaining faithful. These words, written in the gathering darkness of his final winter, would soon be tested by the ultimate challenge that medieval Christianity could devise. The council's judgment, when it finally came, possessed the formal magnificence that marked all the great ceremonies of medieval Christianity. Cardinals and bishops, dressed in their finest robes and surrounded by the symbols of their authority, pronounced a sentence with a solemnity that befitted such momentous occasions. But beneath the ceremonial grandeur lay a machinery of spiritual control that had been refined through centuries of practice, and Jan Hus was about to discover the full extent of its power. The morning of July 6th, 1415, dawned gray and humid over Constance, the kind of weather that seemed to press down upon the city like a heavy blanket. In his cell, Jan Hus could hear the sounds of preparation beginning early, the voices of guards speaking in low tones, the creak of wooden wheels on cobblestones as carts delivered materials for the day's grim ceremony. He had spent the night in prayer and reflection, his mind moving between acceptance of his fate and moments of profound human fear about what lay ahead. The final session of the council convened in the cathedral with all the pomp and circumstance that had marked the great occasions of this historic gathering. Cardinals and bishops took their places in a carefully choreographed arrangement that reflected the complex hierarchies of medieval Christianity. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of martyrdom and triumph, cast colored shadows on the assembled delegates as they prepared to witness the conclusion of a process that had consumed months of careful deliberation. Huss was brought before this assembly, wearing the simple robes of a scholar, his appearance dignified despite the months of confinement that had taken their toll on his health. His face, though thinner than it had been when he arrived in Constance, retained the calm expression of a man who had made peace with his circumstances. The chains that bound his hands were more symbolic than practical, for it was clear that he had no intention of attempting to escape his fate. Cardinal Daly, serving as the council's spokesman, rose to address the assembly with the measured gravity that such occasions demanded. "We have gathered," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted space, "to conclude the examination of Jan Hus, Master of Theology from the University of Prague, who has been accused of teaching doctrines contrary to the faith of Holy Mother Church. After careful consideration of his writings and patient examination of his beliefs, we have reached conclusions that we must now present to this assembly." The formal reading of the charges consumed the better part of an hour, each accusation presented with the meticulous attention to detail that marked medieval legal procedure. Hus listened to this catalogue of his supposed errors with the same scholarly attention that he had once brought to examining theological texts, occasionally nodding slightly when a passage from his writings was quoted accurately, showing no reaction when his words were taken out of context or misrepresented. The central accusation, which had emerged as the most serious charge against him, concerned his alleged teaching that the Pope's authority was not absolute, that the Church's hierarchy could err, and that individual Christians had both the right and the duty to examine Scripture for themselves rather than relying entirely on clerical interpretation. These ideas, which had grown naturally from his years of biblical study and pastoral experience, were presented as fundamental challenges to the entire structure of medieval Christianity. The accused, Cardinal Daly continued, has been given numerous opportunities to recant these dangerous errors, to acknowledge the supremacy of church authority, and to submit himself to the correction of his superiors. He has chosen instead to persist in his obstinate adherence to doctrines that have been condemned by previous councils and rejected by the consensus of faithful theologians. The opportunity for final recantation was presented with the same formal courtesy that had marked all the council's proceedings. A document was placed before Hus containing a comprehensive renunciation of his teachings, an acknowledgement of error, and a promise of future submission to ecclesiastical authority. The parchment, written in the precise legal language that characterized such documents, represented his final chance to save himself from the consequences of his theological convictions. Hus examined the document with the same careful attention that he had once brought to studying Scripture, reading each phrase slowly and considering its implications. The assembled delegates waited in silence as he weighed this ultimate choice between physical safety and spiritual integrity. The afternoon sun had begun to slant through the cathedral windows, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complexity of the decision before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority that had marked his years of teaching and preaching. "I came to this council," he said, "in the hope that I might defend the truths that God has revealed through His Word and through the witness of faithful Christians throughout history. I cannot, in good conscience, renounce teachings that I believe to be grounded in Scripture and confirmed by the example of Christ Himself." The formal ceremony of degradation that followed represented one of the most solemn rituals in medieval Christianity's arsenal of spiritual punishments. Hus was stripped of his clerical vestments in a process that symbolically removed him from the community of ordained ministers. Each garment was removed with ceremonial precision, while prayers were recited, asking God to forgive the church for the failure of one of its servants. The ritual transformed him from a minister of the gospel into a condemned heretic, marking his exclusion from the community of the faithful. The procession from the cathedral to the place of execution wound through streets lined with curious onlookers who had gathered to witness this conclusion to the council's work. Huss walked with dignity, despite his chains, occasionally speaking words of encouragement to the few supporters who had managed to position themselves along the route. The crowd's reaction was mixed, reflecting the complex political and religious divisions that had made his case so controversial. The execution site, located in a field outside the city walls, had been prepared with the mechanical efficiency that marked all such occasions. A stake had been driven into the ground and surrounded by carefully arranged bundles of wood and straw. The civil authorities who would carry out this sentence stood ready with the tools of their grim trade, their faces showing the professional detachment of men who had performed such duties many times before. The final moments were marked by a series of ritual exchanges that revealed the complex relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in medieval society. Church officials offered final prayers for the condemned man's soul, while secular authorities took responsibility for the physical execution. This division of labor allowed the church to maintain that it never shed blood, while ensuring that its spiritual judgments were enforced by the full power of the state. Hus used his final minutes to address a crowd that had gathered to witness his fate. His words, spoken in a voice that remained steady despite his circumstances, emphasized his continued faith in the truths he had taught and his confidence that God would ultimately vindicate those who suffered for the sake of conscience. He prayed for his executioners, forgave his enemies, and commended his soul to the mercy of the Christ whose gospel he had tried to serve. The fire that consumed Jan Hus on that July afternoon seemed to burn with unusual intensity, as if the very elements were eager to complete their work. The flames rose high into the summer sky, carrying with them the life of a man who had chosen truth over safety, conviction over compromise. But even as his earthly existence ended, the ideas he had defended continued to smolder in the hearts and minds of those who had heard his message. The ashes of the heretic were gathered and thrown into the Rhine River. It's a final attempt to ensure that no relics of his earthly existence might survive to inspire future generations of dissidents. But this physical destruction could not erase the memory of his courage, the power of his arguments, or the example of his ultimate sacrifice. The council that had condemned him would soon discover that martyrdom possessed a power that transcended the reach of earthly authority. In the years that followed, the name of Jan Hus would become a rallying cry for those who questioned the absolute authority of the church hierarchy. His death would inspire the Hussite wars that would convulse Bohemia for decades, and his ideas would eventually find expression in the Protestant Reformation that would transform Christianity throughout Europe. The council that had sought to silence him had instead created a martyr whose influence would far exceed anything he had achieved in life. Deep beneath the stones of Carcassonne, in chambers that have remained undisturbed for centuries, archaeologists have uncovered a collection of artifacts that speak to the methodical nature of medieval justice. The objects lie arranged with careful precision in what was once the basement of an Inquisition tribunal, their positions suggesting that they were left exactly as they had been used during the final days of the institution's operation in southern France. Each piece tells a story of systematic interrogation, of carefully calibrated pressure applied to extract confessions from those suspected of heretical thinking. The interrogation chair, carved from a single piece of oak and worn smooth by countless occupants, sits in the center of what appears to have been the main examination chamber. Its high back and armrests bear the scratches and stains of decades of use, while iron rings embedded in the wood suggest how restraints might have been applied when persuasion alone proved insufficient. The chair faces a raised platform where the interrogator would have sat, positioned to look down upon the subject with the symbolic authority that such elevation provided. Scattered across a nearby table are the implements of what medieval documents euphemistically called rigorous examination. These tools, forged by skilled metalworkers who understood their precise requirements, represent centuries of refinement in the techniques of extracting information from reluctant subjects. The craftsmanship evident in their construction speaks to the institutional commitment to this work, the resources devoted to perfecting methods that could reveal hidden truths without necessarily destroying those who possessed them. The thumbscrews, their brass mechanisms still capable of smooth operation despite centuries of disuse, demonstrate the mechanical precision that medieval artisans brought to their tasks. Each device is calibrated to apply pressure gradually, allowing the interrogator to control precisely the level of discomfort experienced by the subject. The adjustments can be made incrementally, providing opportunities for confession at each stage before the pressure becomes unbearable. Among the most haunting discoveries are the detailed records that accompany these physical implements. Bound volumes, their leather covers darkened with age, contain thousands of pages documenting individual cases with bureaucratic thoroughness. Each interrogation is recorded with meticulous attention to detail, noting not only the questions asked and answers given, but also the physical responses of subjects. The methods employed to encourage truthfulness, the gradual progression of techniques as initial approaches proved insufficient. The handwriting in these records varies, suggesting that multiple scribes were employed to maintain accurate documentation of the proceedings. Some entries are made in elegant Latin script that speaks to the scholarly background of the interrogators, while others appear in more hurried vernacular hands, perhaps reflecting the urgent need to record confessions as they were extracted. The consistency of format across different scribes suggests the existence of standardized procedures, institutional protocols that ensured uniformity in the application of justice. One particularly detailed volume is pages filled with entries dating from the 1240s through the 1270s, provides insight into the systematic nature of heresy investigations in the Languedoc region. Each case begins with basic biographical information about the accused name, age, occupation, family, relationships, before proceeding to document the specific accusations that have brought them to official attention. The progression from initial questioning through various stages of examination is recorded with clinical detachment, creating a comprehensive record of institutional procedure. The physical evidence of confession extraction includes implements whose purposes become clear only when considered alongside the documentary records. Iron devices designed to immobilize specific parts of the body, adjustable clamps that could apply controlled pressure to sensitive areas, and carefully designed restraints that prevented movement while allowing access for questioning. All speak to the sophistication of medieval interrogation techniques. Perhaps most revealing are the records of false confessions, cases where subsequent investigation revealed that subjects had admitted to crimes they had not committed simply to end their ordeal. These documents, marked with marginal notes indicating the discovery of error, provide insight into the limitations of information obtained under duress. The institutional response to such discoveries was typically to refine techniques rather than to question the fundamental validity of the approach. The chamber's acoustics, still measurable despite centuries of decay, were clearly designed to enhance the psychological impact of the proceedings. The vaulted ceiling amplifies sound in ways that would have made even whispered conversations clearly audible, while the stone walls create an echo that would have given additional weight to both questions and answers. The single window, positioned high in the wall and equipped with iron bars, provides minimal light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that would have disoriented subjects and increased their dependence on their tanned interrogators. Archaeological analysis of the chambers. Construction reveals multiple phases of development, suggesting that the facility was expanded and refined over decades of use. Earlier sections show simpler construction techniques, while later additions incorporate sophisticated features designed to enhance the efficiency of interrogation procedures. The evolution of the physical space mirrors the institutional development of inquisitorial techniques, each improvement reflecting lessons learned from previous experience. The discovery of hidden compartments within the chamber walls has yielded additional artifacts that speak to the clandestine aspects of this work. Documents sealed in lead containers include correspondence between interrogators and their superiors, revealing the administrative framework within which these investigations operated. Letters discuss quotas for confessions, compare techniques employed in different regions, and provide guidance for handling particularly difficult cases. Among the most disturbing finds are personal items that appear to have belonged to those who underwent examination in these chambers. Rosary beads, their wooden surfaces worn smooth by countless prayers, suggest the desperate faith of those who found themselves subject to institutional scrutiny. Prayer books, their pages marked with what appears to be dried blood, speak to the physical toll extracted during the process of spiritual examination. The methodical organization of these artifacts suggests that the chamber was abandoned deliberately rather than hastily. Tools are arranged according to their function. Documents are filed in logical order, and personal effects are cataloged with the same precision that marked official records. This careful preservation creates the impression of an institution that maintained its commitment to systematic procedure even during its final operations. Chemical analysis of stains found throughout the chamber provides additional insight into the reality of medieval interrogation techniques. Blood traces, concentrated in specific areas around the interrogation chair and examination table, confirm that physical coercion was indeed employed when other methods proved insufficient. However, the relatively limited extent of such evidence suggests that the threat of violence was often more effective than its actual application. The acoustic properties of the chamber also reveal evidence of psychological manipulation beyond simple intimidation. Hidden speaking tubes, cleverly concealed within the stone construction, would have allowed voices to be projected from unseen locations, creating the impression of supernatural observation or divine judgment. Such techniques reflect the sophisticated understanding that medieval interrogators possessed regarding the psychological dimensions of their work. Perhaps most haunting of all are the fragments of confession documents that were apparently discarded as drafts or practice exercises. These partial texts reveal the formulaic nature of many admissions, suggesting that subjects were coached in the specific language required for acceptable confessions. The repetitive phrasing and standardized admissions of guilt speak to an institutional process designed to produce predictable results rather than to discover individual truth. The chamber's ventilation system, still partially intact, demonstrates additional consideration for the practical requirements of prolonged interrogation sessions. Carefully positioned openings ensure adequate air circulation while maintaining the oppressive atmosphere necessary for effective questioning. The engineering involved suggests significant investment in creating optimal conditions for extracting information from reluctant subjects. Modern forensic analysis of the implements themselves reveals the sophisticated metallurgy employed in their construction. The quality of the steel, the precision of the mechanisms, and the attention to ergonomic details all speak to a level of craftsmanship that reflects serious institutional commitment to this work. These were not crude instruments of random violence, but carefully designed tools created by skilled artisans for specific professional purposes. The discovery of training materials among the chamber's contents provides additional insight into the institutional nature of this work. manuals describing proper interrogation techniques, guidelines for recognizing signs of deception, and protocols for progressing through different levels of examination. All suggest the existence of a sophisticated educational system designed to prepare practitioners for their duties. The preservation of these artifacts in their original context provides an unprecedented window into the practical operation of medieval justice. Unlike scattered finds or incomplete records, this collection offers a comprehensive view of how institutional authority was exercised at its most fundamental level. The combination of physical implements, detailed documentation, and preserved architectural space creates a complete picture of systematic spiritual control. In the scriptorium of the Dominican convent of Saint Jacques in Paris, Brother Matthias bent over his writing desk in the gray light of dawn, his quill moving with practiced precision across sheets of carefully prepared parchment. The documents, taking shape beneath his hand, bore the formal seals and elaborate decorations that marked official church correspondence. But their content dealt with matters that would determine life and death for accused heretics across France. As chief scribe for the Inquisition's administrative apparatus, Matthias possessed an intimate knowledge of the bureaucratic machinery that transformed theological suspicion into legal condemnation. The morning's work involved transcribing confessions, extracted during interrogations conducted throughout the previous week. Each document followed a precise format that had been refined through decades of institutional experience, beginning with the basic biographical information of the accused, proceeding through a detailed account of their alleged heresies, and concluding with their formal admission of guilt and plea for mercy. The standardized language ensured that confessions from different regions and different interrogators would possess the legal consistency required for institutional proceedings. Brother Matthias had served in this capacity for nearly 15 years, and as practiced, I could discern patterns in the confessions that revealed much about the techniques employed to obtain them. The progression from initial denials through gradual admissions followed predictable stages, suggesting that interrogators across the realm employed similar methods to encourage truthfulness. The language used to describe heretical beliefs showed remarkable consistency, as if subjects had been guided towards specific formulations that satisfied legal requirements. The physical process of creating these documents required specialized materials and techniques that reflected the importance of accurate record-keeping to the Inquisition's operations. The parchment itself was prepared according to strict specifications, treated with chemicals that would prevent fading and ensure long-term preservation. The ink was formulated to resist both time and deliberate alteration, while the quills were selected and prepared to provide the precise line, quality required for legal documents. Each confession required multiple copies, creating an extensive network of documentation that spread across the administrative hierarchy of medieval Christianity. The original remained in local files for immediate reference, while copies were forwarded to regional authorities, episcopal offices, and ultimately to papal bureaucrats in Rome. This multiplication of records ensured that information about suspected heretics was preserved and accessible to officials who might need to reference it years or even decades later. The work required more than simple copying skills. Brother Matthias needed to understand the theological implications of the statements he transcribed, ensuring that technical language was rendered accurately and that subtle distinctions in doctrine were preserved. His training had included extensive study of condemned propositions, familiarizing him with the specific formulations that constituted heretical thinking according to church authority. This knowledge allowed him to recognize when confessions might require clarification or additional detail. The seasonal rhythm of his work reflected the institutional calendar of the Inquisition, with periods of intense activity corresponding. 2 major investigative campaigns, followed by quieter intervals devoted to administrative consolidation. Spring often brought increased activity as travel became easier and new investigations could be launched in regions where winter weather had suspended operations. Summer provided optimal conditions for large-scale proceedings that might involve multiple communities and extensive witness testimony. The archives surrounding Brother Matthias contained the accumulated documentation of centuries of heresy investigations, creating a comprehensive library of spiritual deviation that served both practical and scholarly purposes. Legal precedents could be researched when unusual cases arose, while patterns of heretical thinking could be tracked across different regions and time periods. The collection also served educational purposes, providing training materials for new inquisitors and examples of proper procedure for administrative staff. Among the most challenging aspects of his work was the transcription of recantations, formal statements in which condemned heretics renounced their errors and begged for reconciliation with the Church. These documents required particular precision because they served both legal and theological functions, formally documenting the subject's return to orthodoxy while providing protection against future accusations of the same heresies. The language had to be sufficiently comprehensive to cover all aspects of the subjects previous errors while remaining clear enough for public proclamation. The correspondence files that Brother Matthias maintained revealed the extensive communication network that connected Inquisition offices across Europe. Letters flowed constantly between different regions, sharing information about suspected heretics, coordinating investigations that cross jurisdictional boundaries, and disseminating new techniques for detecting and combating spiritual corruption. This network created a continental system of surveillance that could track individuals and ideas across vast distances. The financial records integrated cadence into this documentation system provided insight into the economic dimensions of heresy prosecution. Detailed accounts tracked the costs of investigations, proceeds from confiscated property, and the fees charged for various services related to spiritual reconciliation. These figures revealed that the Inquisition operated as a significant economic institution, generating substantial revenue that supported its extensive operations while also contributing to broader church finances. The process of document authentication involved elaborate procedures designed to prevent forgery and ensure the integrity of official records. Multiple seals, specialized inks, and distinctive formatting all served to mark genuine Inquisition documents, while detailed registries tracked the production and distribution of sensitive materials. Brother Matthias himself possessed several different seals that were used for different types of documents, each carefully guarded and accounted for to prevent unauthorized use. The human cost of this bureaucratic efficiency became apparent in the personal details that occasionally surfaced in official documents. Marginal notes describe families destroyed by investigations, communities fragmented by suspicion, and individuals who had been broken by the process of examination. These glimpses of human suffering were recorded with the same clinical detachment that marked all official documentation, creating a permanent record of institutional impact on individual lives. The preservation techniques employed for these documents reflected the Church's understanding that accurate records would be essential for future reference. Special storage conditions protected parchment from moisture and pests, while careful indexing systems ensured that specific cases could be located quickly when needed. The investment in long-term preservation suggested that officials expected these records to remain relevant for generations to come. The training of new scribes involved extensive instruction in both technical skills and institutional procedures, ensuring that the quality and consistency of documentation would be maintained across different personnel and time periods. Brother Matthias himself had been responsible for training dozens of younger clerks, passing on not only the mechanical skills of transcription, but also the deeper understanding of legal and theological requirements that distinguished professional Inquisition scribes from ordinary copyists. The psychological toll of this work occasionally surfaced in private correspondence and personal documents that survived alongside official records. The constant exposure to accounts of spiritual corruption, the detailed descriptions of interrogation procedures, and the repetitive nature of confession formulas created their own form of institutional trauma. Some scribes requested transfers to other duties, while others developed elaborate personal devotional practices designed to counteract the spiritual contamination of their professional responsibilities. Excavations beneath the medieval church of Santa Maria la Real in Pamplona have yielded discoveries that illuminate the hidden infrastructure of spiritual surveillance that permeated medieval society. Workers renovating the crypt discovered a network of concealed chambers and passages that appeared to have served functions far removed from normal religious observance. The architectural sophistication of these hidden spaces, combined with artifacts found within them, suggests a systematic approach to monitoring and controlling the spiritual lives of ordinary believers. The primary chamber, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind the main altar, contains features that speak to its use for clandestine interrogations and secret proceedings. The walls, constructed with unusual acoustic properties, would have allowed conversations to be conducted in complete privacy while ensuring that every word was clearly audible to hidden observers. Stone benches built into the walls show where patterns consistent with regular use over extended periods, while iron rings embedded in the masonry suggest that restraints were sometimes employed. Carbon dating of organic materials found within these chambers places their active use between the late 13th and early 15th centuries, corresponding precisely with the period of most intensive Inquisition activity in the region. The preservation of these artifacts in an anaerobic environment has allowed modern searchers to examine materials that would normally have decomposed centuries ago, providing unprecedented insight into the practical operation of medieval spiritual surveillance. Among the most significant discoveries are fragments of confession documents that were apparently hidden rather than destroyed when the chambers were abandoned. These papers, written in multiple hands and languages, document cases that never appeared in official records, suggesting the existence of a parallel system of justice that operated outside normal institutional channels. The content of these confessions reveals investigations into forms of spiritual deviation that went far beyond traditional definitions of heresy. The physical layout of the hidden chambers reflects sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and information extraction. The main interrogation room is positioned below ground level, creating a sense of burial that would have been deeply unsettling to medieval minds, accustomed to associating underground spaces with death and damnation. The single entrance, concealed behind religious imagery, would have reinforced the sense that subjects were entering a space where normal rules no longer applied. Chemical analysis of stains found throughout the chambers provides disturbing evidence of the methods employed within these spaces. Blood traces, concentrated around specific locations, suggest that physical coercion was indeed used when other approaches proved insufficient. However, the relatively limited extent of such evidence indicates that the threat of violence was often more effective than its actual application, reflecting the sophisticated psychological understanding that informed medieval interrogation techniques. The discovery of specialized furniture within the chambers reveals the systematic nature of the activities conducted there. A chair constructed with hidden restraints, positioned to face a raised platform where interrogators would have sat, demonstrates the attention to symbolic authority that marked all aspects of Inquisition procedure. The furniture's construction, involving skilled craftsmanship and expensive materials, suggests significant institutional investment in creating optimal conditions for extracting information. Perhaps most revealing are the personal artifacts left behind when the chambers were abandoned. Rosary beads, their wooden surfaces stained with what appears to be dried tears, speak to the desperate faith of those who found themselves subject to secret examination. Prayer books, their pages marked with annotations that suggest intensive use during periods of extreme stress, provide insight into the spiritual resources that sustained individuals through these ordeals. The ventilation system, designed for these chambers demonstrates additional consideration for the practical requirements of extended interrogation sessions. Carefully positioned air shafts ensure adequate circulation while maintaining the oppressive atmosphere necessary for effective questioning. The engineering involved reflects significant investment in creating conditions that would maximize the psychological pressure on subjects while ensuring their physical survival. Modern forensic examination of the chamber walls has revealed evidence of a sophisticated surveillance system that allowed activities to be monitored from concealed locations. Hidden apertures, positioned as strategic points around the interrogation space, so to provide clear views of proceedings while keeping observers invisible to subjects. This arrangement reflects the understanding that knowledge of being watched could be as effective as direct interrogation in encouraging truthful responses. The acoustic properties of the chambers also reveal evidence of psychological manipulation beyond simple intimidation. The stone construction creates echo effects that would have amplified certain sounds while muffling others, creating a disorienting auditory environment that would have enhanced subjects' sense of isolation and vulnerability. Hidden speaking tubes, cleverly integrated into the masonry, would have allowed voices to be projected from unexpected directions, creating the impression of supernatural observation. The preservation of administrative materials within the chambers provides insight into the bureaucratic framework that supported these clandestine operations. Partially destroyed documents include correspondence with church authorities, financial records, tracking expenses related to secret investigations, and personnel files documenting the assignment of clergy to surveillance duties. This paperwork reveals the institutional nature of what might otherwise appear to be isolated incidents of abuse. The discovery of specialized tools within the chambers speaks to the systematic nature of information extraction techniques employed in medieval spiritual investigations. Implements designed to cause precisely calibrated discomfort, restraints that could be adjusted to maintain pressure without causing permanent damage, and devices for monitoring physical responses all reflect sophisticated understanding of human psychology and physiology. The chamber's isolation from the main church structure suggests that activities conducted there were considered sensitive even by medieval standards. The concealed entrance, soundproof construction, and separate ventilation system all indicate deliberate efforts to maintain secrecy around these operations. This architectural evidence supports documentary accounts suggesting that some Inquisition activities were conducted outside normal institutional oversight. The careful preservation of evidence within these chambers, despite their abandonment centuries ago, suggests that those responsible for their operation maintained detailed records for future reference. The systematic arrangement of artifacts, the protection of documents against decay, and the secure sealing of entrances all reflect institutional thinking that anticipated eventual return to these facilities. The psychological impact of discovering these chambers has been significant even for modern researchers who report feeling deeply unsettled by exposure to spaces designed for systematic intimidation and control. The preservation of these environments in their original condition creates an immediate connection to the fear and suffering experienced by those who were subjected to examination within them, making the historical reality of medieval spiritual surveillance tangibly present. The integration of these chambers into a functioning religious space reflects the complex relationship between official church activities and the clandestine operations of spiritual surveillance. The use of sacred architecture to conceal systematic intimidation suggests a sophisticated understanding of how religious authority could be leveraged to support institutional control over individual conscience and belief. The great hall of the Episcopal Palace in Toulouse was ablaze with the light of hundreds of candles as Cardinal Guillaume hosted his quarterly gathering of senior Inquisition officials from across the Languedoc region. This occasion, ostensibly a religious feast celebrating the feast day of Saint Dominic, served equally as an opportunity for the ecclesiastical elite to coordinate their activities. share intelligence about heretical movements, and reinforce the social bonds that sustained their collective authority. The assembled prelates, their scarlet and purple robes, creating a symphony of color against the hall's stone walls, represented the highest levels of institutional power in medieval Christianity. The feast itself was a masterpiece of medieval culinary art, prepared by a kitchen staff that had spent weeks gathering ingredients from across Europe to create a meal worthy of the assembled dignitaries. Roasted peacocks, their feathers carefully preserved and reattached for presentation, graced the high table alongside swans stuffed with exotic spices and decorated with gold leaf. Subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting scenes of saints triumphing over heretics, provided both visual spectacle and symbolic reinforcement of the evening's underlying themes. Archbishop Bertrand de la Tour, the cardinal's most senior colleague and longtime collaborator in anti-heretical activities, occupied the place of honor to his host's right. The archbishop, a man whose family connections to French nobility had smoothed his path to ecclesiastical prominence, possessed both the intellectual sophistication and political acumen necessary for success in the complex world of medieval church politics. His conversation with the cardinal, conducted in the cultured Latin that marked their scholarly backgrounds, touched on matters of policy and procedure that would affect thousands of lives across their jurisdictions. The wine that flowed freely throughout the evening came from vineyards that had been confiscated from condemned heretics, their production now supporting the very institution that had destroyed their former owners. The irony was not lost on the assembled guests, who found dark humor in the transformation of heretical property into ecclesiastical sustenance. The vintage, aged in cellars that had once stored the possessions of prosperous merchant families before their condemnation for spiritual crimes, possessed a complexity that seemed appropriate for this occasion. The entertainment provided during the meal reinforced the evening's themes through carefully selected performances that celebrated orthodox triumph over heretical error. A troupe of musicians presented songs that recounted the victories of previous generations of inquisitors, fusing together religious devotion and institutional pride in ways that stirred the emotions of the assembled prelates. Jongleurs performed dramatic scenes depicting the conversion of heretics through the patient application of ecclesiastical justice, their exaggerated gestures and colorful costumes providing comic relief that helped digestion of both food and ideology. The informal conversations that took place between formal courses revealed the human dimensions of institutional power that were rarely visible in official documents. Bishop Arnaud of Pamiers, whose jurisdiction included some of the most troublesome heretical communities in the region, shared amusing anecdotes about the creative excuses offered by accused individuals seeking to avoid investigation. The laughter that greeted these stories reflected both genuine humor and the psychological defense mechanisms that allowed good men to participate in systematic intimidation without losing their sense of moral righteousness. The table settings themselves conveyed messages about hierarchy and authority that were immediately understood by all present. The cardinal's place was marked by a tableware of solid gold, while his immediate subordinates employed silver plate that reflected their slightly lower status. The gradual diminution of luxury as one moved away from the head table created a visual representation of ecclesiastical rank that reinforced social relationships even during supposedly informal gatherings. The topics of conversation during the meal ranged from theological abstractions to practical considerations of administration and enforcement. Prior Guillaume, Dominican scholar whose treatises on heretical identification had become standard texts throughout Europe, gauged his colleagues in discussions about the subtle signs that might reveal hidden Cather sympathies and communities that had ostensibly returned to orthodox practice. His observations, delivered with the precision of a professor addressing students, provided practical guidance that would shape investigative procedures across the region. The servants who attended the banquet was carefully selected for their loyalty and discretion, moved through the hall with practiced efficiency that spoke to years of experience serving ecclesiastical functions. Their presence was so unobtrusive as to be nearly invisible, creating the impression that the magnificent meal appeared through supernatural intervention rather than human labor. This theatrical effect, carefully cultivated through extensive preparation and rehearsal, reinforced the sense of divine favor that ecclesiastical authorities claimed to enjoy. The architectural setting of the banquet provided its own commentary on the relationship between spiritual authority and material prosperity. The hall's vaulted ceiling, decorated with frescoes depicting biblical scenes of divine judgment, rose high above tables laden with earthly abundance. Stained glass windows, their religious imagery illuminated by carefully positioned torches, cast colored light on proceedings that celebrated both heavenly truth and earthly power. The juxtaposition of sacred and secular elements created an atmosphere that seemed to sanctify the luxury surrounding the assembled prelates. The after-dinner entertainment included presentations by scholars who had spent their careers studying heretical movements and developing more effective techniques for combating spiritual corruption. Dr. Johannes, professor from the University of Paris, whose expertise in theological disputation had made him invaluable to Inquisition operations, delivered a learned discourse on the psychological characteristics that predispose individuals toward heretical thinking. His analysis, supported by case studies drawn from recent investigations, provided insights that would inform future interrogation procedures. The gifts exchanged during the evening reflected both personal relationships and institutional alliances that sustained the anti-heretical campaign across Europe. Illuminated manuscripts containing the latest developments in interrogation technique, precious reliquaries that served as symbols of orthodox devotion, and letters of recommendation that could advance careers within ecclesiastical hierarchies, all circulated among the assembled guests. These exchanges created networks of mutual obligation and shared interests that transcended individual jurisdictions. The cardinal's closing address to his guests combined spiritual exhortation with practical guidance that would shape their activities in the months ahead. His words, delivered with the authority of decades of experience in combating heretical movements, emphasized both the sacred nature of their mission and the material rewards that faithful service could bring. The applause that greeted his remarks reflected genuine enthusiasm for the work ahead, as well as appreciation for the comfortable circumstances that made such dedication possible. The private conversations that continued after the formal conclusion of the banquet revealed the personal costs that even successful ecclesiastical careers could exact from those who pursued them. Bishop Fouts, whose aggressive prosecution of heretics in the Corbières region had earned him both promotion and substantial personal wealth, confided to close colleagues about the nightmares that sometimes disturbed his sleep. The toll of systematic intimidation affected even those who benefited most directly from its practice, creating inner conflicts that had to be constantly managed and rationalized. In the pre-dawn darkness of his private chapel, Cardinal Guillaume knelt before an altar, glittered with treasures accumulated through decades of successful anti-heretical campaigns. The crucifix that dominated the sacred space was crafted from gold confiscated from a wealthy Cathar merchant whose property had been seized following his execution for heretical beliefs. The silver candlesticks that flanked this centerpiece had once graced the private oratory of a noble family whose lands now belonged to the church following their condemnation for spiritual crimes. Even the precious stones that adorned the altar cloth had been pried from jewelry worn by women who had chosen death rather than renounce their faith. The cardinal's personal devotions, conducted in solitude before beginning each day's administrative duties, reflected the complex psychological accommodations required of men who exercised ultimate spiritual authority while accumulating enormous material wealth. His prayers included genuine requests for divine guidance in matters of doctrine and procedure, heartfelt appeals for strength to bear the burden of judgment over others' souls, and carefully formulated justifications for the apparent contradictions between evangelical poverty and ecclesiastical prosperity. The weight of a gold pectoral cross that hung from his neck served as a constant physical reminder of both his authority and his moral burden. The ornament, commissioned from the finest goldsmiths in Paris and decorated with gems that represented the spiritual virtues of faith, hope, and charity, had cost more than most nobles spent on their entire households in a year. Yet the cardinal wore it not as personal adornment, but as a symbol of the institutional power that he wielded in service of divine purposes that transcended individual comfort or conscience. His morning correspondence, delivered by messengers who had traveled through the night to ensure timely communication, brought news that illustrated the human cost of the spiritual authority he exercised. A letter from Carcassonne reported the successful conclusion of an investigation that had resulted in the execution of a village priest who had questioned certain aspects of papal authority. Another dispatch from Montpellier described the confiscation of property belonging to an entire extended family whose members had been convicted of maintaining Cathar sympathies, despite years of apparent orthodoxy. The cardinal read these reports with the practiced detachment of a military commander reviewing casualty figures from distant battlefields. The individuals whose lives had been destroyed were reduced to statistical entries in administrative summaries. Their personal agonies transformed into evidence of institutional effectiveness. This psychological distance was necessary for the efficient operation of systematic spiritual surveillance, but it exacted its own toll on those who maintained it over decades of service. The financial accounts that accompanied these operational reports revealed the material foundations of ecclesiastical power in ways that would have shocked ordinary believers. The property confiscated from condemned heretics generated revenue streams that supported not only current operations, but also long-term institutional expansion. The systematic seizure of homes, lands, livestock, and personal possessions created a self-sustaining economic engine that funded its own growth while providing comfortable lifestyles for those who administered the system. The cardinal's personal physician, a learned man whose medical knowledge included sophisticated understanding of the psychological effects of prolonged stress, made his weekly visit during the morning hours when administrative pressures were at their lowest. The consultation, conducted in the privacy of the cardinal's chambers, addressed not only physical ailments, but also the spiritual and emotional burdens that accompanied ultimate responsibility for others' temporal and eternal welfare. The remedies prescribed included not only herbal preparations, but also recommendations for prayer, fasting, and charitable works designed to counterbalance the moral weight of systematic coercion. The theological library that occupied the cardinal's private study contained volumes that documented centuries of church teaching on the relationship between spiritual authority and temporal power. The collected works of Augustine, Aquinas, and other great doctors of the church provided sophisticated intellectual frameworks for understanding how divine purposes could be served through earthly institutions that accumulated wealth and exercised coercive power. These texts offered comfort and justification for men whose daily lives involved stark contradictions between Christian ideals and institutional necessities. The cardinal's personal confessor, Dominican scholar whose own learning encompassed both moral theology and practical psychology, arrived for their weekly session carrying questions that probed the deepest levels of conscience and motivation. The examination of the cardinal's spiritual state required careful navigation between acknowledgement of moral complexity and affirmation of institutional righteousness. The absolution that concluded these sessions provided not only supernatural forgiveness, but also psychological relief from the burden of moral ambiguity that marked all positions of ultimate authority. The private chambers where the cardinal received visitors suspected of heretical sympathies were designed to project both comfort and authority in ways that facilitated honest communication while maintaining appropriate hierarchical relationships. The furnishings, while luxurious, were selected for their symbolic value. rather than mere personal indulgence. The tapestries depicted scenes of orthodox triumph over heretical error. The books displayed on reading stands contained approved theological texts, and even the refreshments offered to guests were chosen to demonstrate both hospitality and the material prosperity that accompanied spiritual orthodoxy. The personal costs of exercising ultimate spiritual authority became apparent in the cardinals. Private correspondence with family members who remained in secular life, letters from his brother, a successful merchant whose business interests required careful navigation of both ecclesiastical and secular law, revealed the complex tensions that affected families divided between religious and worldly vocations. The advice and protection that the cardinal could offer his relatives created obligations and expectations that sometimes conflicted with his institutional responsibilities. The elaborate precautions that surrounded the cardinal's personal safety reflected both the enemies created by his professional activities and the value that the church placed on preserving experienced administrators. His residence was guarded by men whose loyalty had been tested through years of service. His food was prepared by cooks whose families served as hostages for their faithfulness, and his travel arrangements included security measures that rivaled those employed by secular rulers. His constant awareness of danger created an atmosphere of siege mentality that affected all aspects of his daily life. The cardinal's evening prayers, catered in the same chapel where he began each day, included appeals for divine forgiveness that revealed the moral burden carried by those who exercised systematic spiritual coercion. His requests for mercy encompassed not only his own actions, but also the institutional policies that he implemented, the subordinates whose activities he directed, and the larger system of control that he helped to maintain. These private moments of vulnerability provided psychological balance for public displays of confidence and authority. The testament that the cardinal updated annually reflected both his enormous personal wealth and his continuing anxiety about the spiritual implications of material accumulation. The elaborate charitable bequests that he planned included foundations for the poor, endowments for theological education, and provisions for masses to be said for his soul throughout eternity. These gestures toward traditional Christian values served partly as genuine expressions of faith and partly as insurance against divine judgment for a lifetime spent accumulating wealth through systematic intimidation. The final entries in the cardinal's private journal, discovered centuries later during renovation of his former chambers, revealed the psychological toll that decades of exercising ultimate spiritual authority had exacted from even the most successful ecclesiastical careers. His words describe dreams haunted by the faces of those he had condemned, moments of doubt about the righteousness of institutional policies, and growing uncertainty about whether the material prosperity of the church truly served divine purposes or merely human ambition. The golden ring that had marked his authority throughout his career, found still on his finger when his body was discovered in the chapel where he had spent so many hours in prayer and reflection, bore inscriptions that seemed to mock the contradictions of his life. The Latin phrases that proclaimed his devotion to evangelical poverty and his commitment to serving the least of Christ's brethren were engraved on gold that had been purchased with wealth confiscated from families destroyed by his orders. This final irony is preserved in precious metal that would outlast both the man who wore it and the institutional system that had given it meaning. It's provided a fitting monument to the moral complexities that marked the exercise of spiritual authority in medieval Christianity. As the last candle gutters in that distant chapel and the weight of golden crosses settles into eternal silence, we find ourselves emerging from the shadows of a world where thoughts themselves could be crimes, where faith was policed with the same systematic precision that governed taxation or military service. The medieval machinery of spiritual surveillance, with its elaborate bureaucracies and sophisticated techniques, it's created a society where the most dangerous place to be was inside one's own mind. The interrogation chambers we visited at the beginning of our journey, with their worn wooden stools and careful acoustics, represent more than historical curiosities. They embody a fundamental truth about the relationship between institutional power and individual conscience that transcends any particular era or religious system. The techniques of systematic intimidation that Brother Thomas employed with such gentle persistence find their echoes in every age that has sought to control not merely actions, but the thoughts that precede them. Jan Hus, walking with dignity through the streets of Constance toward his final appointment with fire, reminds us that courage often consists not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet refusal to betray convictions that give life meaning. His choice between safety and truth, comfort and conscience, continues to illuminate the moral landscape of every generation that faces similar pressures to conform, to submit, to silence the voices within that whisper dangerous truths. The archaeological evidence scattered through hidden chambers and forgotten archives speaks to the permanence of institutional memory. The way that systems of control preserve themselves in stone and parchment long after their human agents have crumbled to dust. The bloodstains on confession documents, the wear patterns on interrogation chairs, the careful handwriting of scribes who documented human agony with bureaucratic precision, all these bear witness to the reality that ideology, ever noble, its proclaimed purposes, inevitably expresses itself through very human instruments of very material power. And perhaps most haunting of all, the golden rings and elaborate vestments of those who wielded ultimate authority remind us that the most dangerous oppressors are often those who genuinely believe in the righteousness of their cause. Cardinal Gillam, kneeling in his private chapel surrounded by treasures seized from the condemned, embodies the eternal human capacity to transform self-interest into divine mission, to convert institutional necessity into moral imperative. The medieval world of heresy trials may seem distant from our own concerns, separated by centuries of technological and social development. But the fundamental dynamics that drove that system, the fear of difference, the comfort of conformity, the seductive appeal of absolute authority, remain as powerful today as they were when Brother Thomas first opened his manual of interrogation procedure. The machinery of thought control has evolved, become more sophisticated and far-reaching, but its essential purpose remains unchanged: to ensure that individual conscience submits to collective authority. As you settle into sleep tonight, secure in the privacy of your own thoughts and the protection of laws that guard the sanctuary of your mind, remember that such freedoms are not natural rights, but historical achievements, won through the courage of countless individuals who chose truth over safety, conviction over comfort. The price of mental freedom is eternal vigilance, not only against external oppression, but against the internal temptations that make such oppression possible: the desire to belong, the fear of standing alone, the comfortable certainty that comes from never questioning what we are told to believe. The gentle darkness that now surrounds you is not the oppressive shadow of that medieval interrogation chamber, but the peaceful quiet of a mind free to wander, to doubt, to question, to dream, without fear. Rest now in that freedom, and remember that it exists only because others, in ages past, and perhaps in ages yet to come, have been willing to pay the ultimate price to preserve the simple, dangerous, precious right to think forbidden thoughts. Sleep well, and let your dreams be your own.
Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we venture into the shadowed halls of medieval courts, where the simple act of laughter could determine your fate. Settle into your comfortable space. Allow your breathing to slow, and imagine yourself stepping across centuries into a world where every expression was watched, weighed, and judged with the precision of a master craftsman examining precious stones. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a like in this video.